Okay, so I'm back. And now we're going to talk about how to read a poem. I want to tell you something. Teaching in my office sucks. I don't have a classroom. I don't have a projector. I don't have a stereo system. I can't bounce around the room and really make sure you're all doing the work and engaging. Poetry is one of those things. It's like a painting. And if you look at the painting behind me, some of you will love it and some of you will hate it and some of you will not understand it. And some of you might be an expert on Monet or Manet or Impressionism or, oh, that's the Thymes or, oh, that's Italy and the Mediterranean. What if I told you that picture behind me was worth $5 at the thrift store? Some of you would discount its value or its artistic complexity. What if I told you it was worth $5 million? Some of you would be like, no way, I could do that with a paint by numbers. Poetry is the exact same, and it involves our participation, right? One of the assignments that I usually give during the semester is to have poetic experiences, and we're going to play with that concept this week. But really what that's about is finding a poem and figuring out its song, figuring out its home, its motivation, its purpose, its use. And it takes work. It takes an open mind. It takes effort. Poetry is shocking and it's important. So, for example, Virginia Tech poem by Nikki Giovanni that I had you watch last week, that actually is a eulogy. After the Virginia Tech massacre, where the English kid came in an English class with an AR-15 and blew the room up and he killed a bunch of people, they asked Nikki Giovanni, who was English faculty, to come up with closing statements. And instead of lamenting the dead, she came up with this poem, right? We are Virginia Tech. We are proud today. Just thinking about all of the options she had for that speech, and she went with poetry. And the reason she went with poetry is because poetry is powerful. It's so mind-rackingly amazing and complex. There are so many varieties. And I started the process last week asking you to fall in love with poetry, and hopefully we're going to carry that through this week. I'm really hoping that everyone who's not willing to do the work drops, and I've never in my whole 15 years career said that before, but it hurts my heart when I see zeros or when I have people tell me, well, I didn't do that because I'm not interested. Try, guys, try, because poetry deserves the effort. I hope that you will get to know poetry at least enough so that in 5 or 10 years, it can come and find you when you least expect it. So, as I said, a couple of you took me up on my offer and you came and picked up poetry packs. I hope everybody does that, frankly, because this is going to make your life a heck of a lot easier. It's essentially a textbook that I put together. I did all the printing for you. It has the different types. It has meter. It has worksheets. It has handouts. It has a practice exam. It's worth the 10-minute drive to pick up this packet. The first document says how to read a poem. And if you have your poetry pack with you, it's on page 1. If you don't have it, then take notes right now, because I'm going to go through a series of steps and hopefully demonstrate the best ways to approach these coming chapters. One of the comments that I noticed in the previous discussion boards was that there was some shock at the diversity of the poetry. There was a lot of surprise at how hip hop or rhyme, how spoken word can be so dramatic. And yet what often is the case is we don't give credit to these older poems. The poems I'm going to talk to you today are from the 1900s too, and they're just as shocking, they're just as surprising. And so I hope we delve in and we'll have a good time. So here's what it says. There's really only one reason that poetry has gotten a reputation for being so darn difficult. It demands your full attention and won't settle for less. Unlike a novel where you can drift in and out and still follow the plot, poems are generally shorter and more intense, with less of a conventional story to follow. With less of a conventional story, it doesn't mean there isn't one. All poems tell a story. All poems speak to humanity. If you don't make room for the experience, you probably won't have one. The rewards can be high if you make room for the experience. To make an analogy between rock and roll, the difference between a 2.5 minute pop song that the hook makes you sick after your third listen, or a slow building tour de force that sounds fresh and different every time you hear it. This is the difference between poetry done right and poetry where the reader doesn't care. Poetry's only bad if you don't care. And I hope that sinks in on some level, because if you don't get a poem, it's not the poem's fault. It's our fault for not giving it a chance to show its complexity or its beauty or its musical qualities. Aside from its demands on your attention, there's nothing too tricky about reading a poem. Like anything, it's a matter of practice. So here are the steps to how to read a poem. Take notes, because this is going to help you going forward. The first thing is to follow your ears. It's okay to ask, what does it mean when reading a poem? But it's even better to ask, how does it sound? If all else fails, treat it like a song. Even if you can't understand a single thing about the poem's subject or theme, you can always say something, anything about the sound of its words. Does the poem move fast or slow? Does it sound awkward in sections, or does it have an even flow? Do certain words stick around more than others? Trust your inner ear. If the poem sounds strange, it doesn't mean you're reading it wrong. In fact, it probably means you haven't discovered its secret trick. So that's the first step, is listen to your ears. So if you have a textbook, now's the right time to find My Papa's Waltz. It should be right after chapter 12 if you have an old book, or chapter 17 if you have a new one. And this is My Papa's Waltz. This is what it says. It says, the whiskey on your breath could make a small boy dizzy, but I hung on like death. Such waltzing was not easy. We romped until the pan slid from the kitchen shelf. My mother's countenance could not unfrown itself. The hand that held my wrist was battered on one knuckle. At every step you missed, my right ear scraped a buckle. You beat time on my head with a palm caked hard by dirt, then waltzed me off to bed, still clinging to your shirt. So that's me reading it. This is a poem by Theodore Rockcliffe. He was born in 1908. He lived till 1963. And of course, the poem is called My Papa's Waltz. In the previous video, I talked about persona. And this is a great example of persona because the author wrote the poem from the perspective of a little boy's memory. Now, if you were sitting in class in front of me, I would say right now, how many of you think this poem is negative? What are the negative connotation words? And I bet you could find some. Whiskey, dizzy, death, not easy. That's only in the first stanza. Slid, continence, unfrown itself. Battered, scraped, beat. These are really heavy, dark words if you're in 2020. But in 1906 or 1908, these words meant nothing. They meant a hard life. And what I'm going to ask you to do is go beyond the words and our 2020 reaction and listen with your ears. Take a listen.
Hey guys, can you believe that Amazon made billions of dollars and only paid?
My Papa's Waltz. The whiskey on your breath could make a small boy dizzy, but I hung on like death. Such waltzing was not easy. We romped until the pans slid from the kitchen shelf. My mother's countenance could not unfrown itself. The hand that held my wrist was battered on one knuckle. At every step you missed, my right ear scraped a buckle. You beat time on my head with a palm caked hard by dirt, then waltzed me off to bed, still clinging to your shirt.
Now, talk about ears, okay? Now, this is a positive memory poem, actually. And to dissect this, I want to talk about the words in the poem, but more importantly, the sound of the poem, okay? This is about how to listen with your ears. So how many of you know a waltz? Anyone heard a waltz? Let me jog your memory, shall I? Quinceañera flashbacks, right? 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Okay, now, if you've never had a quinceañera, we'll go a different direction. Let's try this one. I hate commercials on YouTube.
Dental.
Give me a
Smile
second.
for zero money down with zero worries. Plus pay zero interest if paid in full within 18 months. With your
1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3.
When we dance together, my world's in disguise. It's a fairyland tale that's come true. And when you
Guys, this is the waltz. It's the Cinderella dance. It's the dance of ballroom and dresses and champagne and gentlemen. This is a dance. Not negative. Positive or negative, the waltz. So next to the word waltz, put a little plus, shall we? Now let's go through the poem again and let's just look with our ears what we find. The whiskey on your breath could make a small boy dizzy, but I clung on like death, such waltzing was not easy. He's having fun. Have you ever heard, and this is actually how I learned to dance, I stood on my dad's feet, and as he waltzed with me, my right ear would scrape his buckle, and he beat time on my head, but I never wanted to go to bed. This is a happy memory of this little boy. Now, what's even more impressive is the meter. Let's try it. The whiskey on my breath, that's 3, could make a small boy dizzy, that's 3. But I hung on like death, such waltzing was not easy. And I'm like, holy shit, it's a waltz. We romped until the pans slid from the kitchen shelf. My mother's countenance could not unfrown itself. The hand that held my wrist was battered on one knuckle, probably because he was working in the coal mines in Kentucky, where the author was from, and his hands were dirty. It was cold. It was dark. He smelled like whiskey because he may have gone to the bar to throw one down to warm up before he went home. But regardless of what you think of the poem, this is a waltz. It's called a waltz, and it's a waltz. It's written in a trimeter. It's anapestic. It's amazing. And I bet we couldn't do that today. How amazing that my Papa's waltz is a waltz. That's called listening with your ears. You're going beyond the words and you're finding the song. The second one. It says read it aloud. Okay, we're not saying you have to shout it. But read it aloud. That's the only way you're going to hear the rhythm. The whiskey on my breath could make a small boy dizzy. The whiskey on your breath could make a small boy dizzy, but I hung on like death. Such waltzing is not easy. I can't find the meter if I don't read it out loud. Every poem is spoken word poetry, guys. These poems were written in a time where there was no TV, there was no radio, there was no computers. What did you do after dinner? You sat by a fireplace and you recited poetry to each other. Now, I read in the discussion posts, oh, these are really dumb old poems. I'm not so interested. They don't have to be. If you read them aloud, you can give them life. And that's how poetry is supposed to be read. The third point, becoming an archaeologist. When you've drunk in the poem enough times, experiencing the sound and the images found there, it's sometimes fun to switch gears and become an archaeologist. You know someone who digs up the past and uncovers layers of history? Treat the poem like a room you've just entered. Is it a strange room? Have you seen it before? Are there historical allusions, ALLUSION, that point to historical people, time, or events? Now let's go to this poem. It says, we romped until the pans. Romped. That's not a modern world. Playhouse, roughhouse, romped. This tells me it's an old poem. We're describing some kind of play. Slid from the kitchen shelf. This is a time when kitchens had shelves, not cabinets. My mother's countenance could not unfrown itself. Her frown. She thinks, stop playing in the kitchen. Go dance in the living room. Go dance by the fire. Quit messing in my kitchen. As far as I can tell, that's pretty modern day equivalent to any mom today. The hand that held my wrist was battered on one knuckle. At every step you missed, my right ill scraped a buckle. What are we talking about? We're talking about the dad's belt buckle. It's holding his pants up. This is a time marker. It's a period piece, and it matters a lot because it gives us context. This is not about a drunk abuse story. This is about a time period where the men worked hard, they wore belt buckles, and the women were just as tired and frayed. And the little bit of fun that this child has was the waltzing. The next one. Don't skim. Read a poem 10 times, guys. 10 times to different music. 10 times to different environments. 10 times. That's what I want you to do. Unlike the newspaper or textbook, the point of poetry isn't to cram information into your brain. We can't repeat it enough. Poetry is an experience. If you don't have the patience to get through a long poem, no worries. Start with a really, really short one and find its home. Have a poetic experience. So in your textbook, there's a poem. It's called The Red Wheelbarrow. Wheelbarrow. And I'm going to read it to you first. I met this poem when I was at community college about 15, 20 years ago now. And I didn't understand it. I admit that. I thought, what a stupid poem. Here's how it goes. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater, besides the white chickens. Now, I'll put these links up next to my video, but if you go to YouTube, like I'm doing right now, and I put in red wheel, did I mention I can't spell? Barrow poem. There's this really goofy one. Listen to the music. So much depends. It's showing a horse walk across the screen upon a red wheelbarrow. And I'm like, what the heck is it talking about? Maybe I'm missing something. Maybe I need to listen to it being read out loud. So I'm going to find actually William Carlos, and I'm going to have him read me his poem.
The Red Wheelbarrow. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens.
And I'm like, that is so weird. I never thought about the poem again. I passed my English 2 class. I went on with life. Then in 2013, I bought a house. Let me tell you about this house. It has a lot of rock in the backyard. There were tons and tons and tons of rock. And I wanted a patio. I wanted grass. And I called a contractor and I asked him to come and give me a bid on the backside of my house. How much will you charge me if I want you to get rid of all that rock? And the contractor said, well, I'll do it for about 10 grand. 10 grand, are you kidding? I have a shovel and a bucket. So let me show you what I did. I got my little shovel and I got my bucket and I proceeded to remove the rock. And I couldn't pick up the bucket, so I had to dump some out. And then I waddled like this around the house to the front and dump it in the dumpster. I did about 10 loads. And the next day I woke up and I couldn't breathe. I was so tired. And I went into the backyard and I thought, oh my God, there's a lot of rock out here. What the heck am I going to do? Now that day, I still put it in the bucket, but I put the bucket on top of one of my kids' skateboards. But it didn't work well because the skateboard doesn't roll on the rock. My son came in and said, Mom, why don't you use a wheelbarrow? Oh my God. Let me tell you, this poem hit me. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow. Now, in my case, it was yellow. Glazed with rainwater. You know how you tip it up and it glistens in the morning? It's the most beautiful invention ever made. Now, I'm not still sure about the white chickens, because back then I think everybody had chickens. But what I can tell you is that this is a brilliant poem when you're removing rock, when you're moving hay, when you're playing dead soldier, when you're trying to plant cactus, when you're cleaning out and mucking a stable. Why in the world would anyone not use a wheelbarrow? Listen.
The red wheelbarrow. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens.
This guy was brilliant. He lived in an age where there was an underappreciated invention, and he celebrated it with poetry. I will never go without a wheelbarrow again. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow. I just had to find the poem's home. Now, when I go to the second page on the back side, the other points are to be patient, to read in crazy places, to think like a poet, and to always pay attention to who's talking. Poetry is about freedom and exposing yourself to new things. In fact, you find yourself stuck in a poem, just remember that the poet himself was exploring ideas that they thought were worthy of thinking, experiencing, loving, believing, seeing, understanding. Poetry is this doorway to looking at the world in a different way, and I really hope that you jump on board this week. So much depends.